to those of you or friends and family. We're not putting out public yet, but if those of you that are home working, or you know people that are home working, or have kids that are, I would say, middle school, high school, that could be here on their own. We're opening up the Sunday school rooms. We could open up in here. We've gotten Clorox wipes to wipe everything down once they're done. But if you know people that could just use some time out of their home, they could be here Monday through Thursday when we're open, when we're here, and we need to know 24 hours ahead of time so that we're aware and we're ready and we know that somebody's actually going to be here. So let people know if you know of families that could use a little respite or just be someplace else. Or I was telling somebody about this and they said, oh, maybe there's some people that would just like to come and pray or just have time, have devotion time, have quiet time outside of their home. And so we won't bother you, we won't talk to you, you don't have to be entertained, but if you want to come and use some space, the church is open from 9 to 4, most Monday through Thursdays. And so please take advantage of using this space, or if you know people that could use that respite. Also, I'm planning on doing Praise and Pie as a Zoom gathering on Tuesday the 24th. I think it's the 24th, whatever that Tuesday is before Thanksgiving. I've done this early on in the process, but haven't done it. So you'll get an invitation, and if you would like to join, you'll just be able to click that and join us. You know, if you want to have a piece of pie ready. But I really want us to be able to talk about what have we had good happen in 2020. We've just looked at like, oh, this has been a stinker of a year. But as I've been thinking about it, writing it down, there have been good things, and good things that even the pandemic has caused us to have to do, or whatever it might be. So I want you to be thinking, you might have to dig deep to find those good things, but I encourage you to be part of that, and we can have all of you there, and it would be about, we can only go about 40 minutes because I don't have the right kind of whatever you need to go longer. So we'll be there together about 40 minutes. And so think about that, and I'll just send out an invitation, and who comes, and we'll have a great time together. So that's two things that I forgot. Speaking of little fall holidays, just a couple weeks ago we had Halloween. And you know, Halloween was different, but we did go with little Ruby to her favorite neighbors in her White Bear neighborhood. And they were all anticipating her, and they had these little bags all ready, and she got into the whole idea of what it was, and trick or treat, and she'd get to the door, and she finally just walked up to the door and says, I want candy. I mean, she does forget about the trick or treat business, says, I want candy. And so we didn't go to too many places, but we came back home and we were watching a movie and talking about what Halloweens have been for us. And we kind of just went to the people they knew, and that's what we did with our kids. We lived out in the woods, we didn't have a neighborhood to go to, and so we would go to those favorite people from our church. We'd drive into Forest Lake and go see the old grandma and grandpas that we knew, but then eventually my brother and his wife moved into a neighborhood in Wyoming where the kids could go door to door. And Dan would drive them down the street, and it would be so cold, and they'd run back into the van and back out again. They'd come home with a pretty good haul of candy. Well, our kids are 6 years apart. So Amanda would have been about 4 or 5, and Christopher would have been 10 or 11. And they would come home and dump their candy in the living room floor, and Christopher would start dealing with his sister. Well, she was little, and she didn't realize that there were bad trades happening. And he would say, well, I'll give you this Tootsie Pop for that full-size Hershey bar. And by the end of the trade system, he ended up with this big old pile of big stuff, and she had this little pile of stuff, and it didn't really bother her at first. She didn't realize she still had candy, but eventually she realized this is not fair. And I would say, honey, life isn't fair. You know, this is one of the first unfairnesses that you're going to experience. And I knew that it didn't matter because Easter would come and I would throw away their Halloween candy. And then we'd start all over with the Easter candy. And then we'd throw that away like at the beginning of October because, so my kids weren't big candy eaters, so I knew it wasn't a big deal. But she learned about this was unfair. This was unfair. A lot of times we see things in life that are not fair. Somebody gets a job that we felt that we were more qualified for, or somebody gets a scholarship and we don't. Someone gets, this one gets me. They get in the longer line at McDonald's and get served first. I always feel like that's unfair. And when life is unfair, it just happens. No one has planned it, it just happens. Life is unjust because someone has purposely caused us to be treated less or given less. Like the case of the Halloween candy. Christopher knew exactly what he was doing. That was unjust because he knew what he was doing to his little sister. Unfair just kind of happens. Unjust is planned. In this week's reading, thank you, Aiden, of Amos, one of the focal points of this prophecy is justice, social justice, and morality. And what do we know about justice and morality, really? By definition, justice is a concept on ethics and law that means that people behave in a way that is fair, equal, and balanced for everyone. That is everyone, no matter race, gender, sex, class, religion. The Bible mentions justice 170 times. Justice is important to God. Listen to just a few verses as examples. Exodus 23:6. In a lawsuit, you must not deny justice to the poor. Leviticus 19:6. Many of these are in that first Torah that God is giving out and Moses is lining up the laws for the people. This is how you should live. Leviticus 19:5. Do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor or being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. Deuteronomy 10:18. He ensures that orphans and widows receive justice. He knows love to the foreigners living among you, and he gives them food and clothing. Solomon asked for wisdom when God said, what do you want? I'll give you anything. And he asked for wisdom to govern the people with justice. 1 Chronicles 16:14. He is the Lord our God. His justice is seen throughout the land. God's justice is seen throughout the land. Job mentions justice 14 times, which I found interesting as I was looking through. I was going to use some of them, but there was 14 of them, and he keeps talking about God is just, even when we know what Job went through. Psalm 99:4. Mighty God, mighty King, lover of justice, you have established fairness. You have acted with justice and righteousness throughout Israel. Mighty King, lover of justice. It's important to God. Isaiah 42:1. Look at my servant whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one who pleases me. I have put my spirit upon him, and he will bring justice to the nations. Who is Isaiah talking about here? Obviously, it's a quote that describes what Jesus came to do in his earthly ministry, to bring justice. So if we are followers of Jesus, as I think everyone in this room would say, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus, and we are doing what he taught and what he modeled and what he desired for us, how we should live, we should also be bringing justice to the nations and to the world. Justice for all people. When I was in elementary school, I don't think they do it anymore, I'm not sure, every single morning we stood up and we said the Pledge of Allegiance. And right or wrong, I'm not here to argue it today, that's not my point. But what we said with great conviction as elementary school students in Siren, Wisconsin, was that I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We said that with great conviction in the 1960s. Yes, I'm that old. And it's very ironic that we said it with great conviction, and yet there were riots going on, civil rights riots. We were seeing on TV where people were being hosed down and dogs were going after the black people that were marching for freedom to vote. There were people like Nancy Olin who were protesting the Vietnam War. She told me that publicly this morning so I can say it. But we were seeing this. As a kid, I was seeing this on TV every night on the news. We were not a nation that was indivisible. We were in very much division, and we have been. And there was not justice for all. And here we are 50 years later, and we're still divided. There's still racial unrest, and there is still not justice for all. I heard someone speak in the last week about the fact that America, he was wonderful, and I wish I would have remembered who he was. Because he was a professor of history, and I think he was on like NBC. And so I think I can go back and find him. But he talked about the fact that America has always been divided. That way back, it was the Patriots and the Saints. No, the Patriots and the colonists. And then it was the abolitionists and the slave owners. And then it was this and this and this. And we've always been a country that's been divided. But how do we handle it, and how do we deal with it, and what do we do with it? We're still at that place where there is not liberty or justice for all. And this is what Amos is talking about to the people of Israel. He has a list of transgressions. He says, you have been selling people, you have been taking advantage of the poor, you have been trampling on the helpless, you have been shoving the oppressed out of the way, you have had sexual immorality, and you have had very poor, not true worship. People of Israel. Injustice upon injustice. And it is for that injustice that they're being punished. God said this through Amos, that there would be judgment, there would be consequences, even exile. And this punishment could not be avoided. And that God is serious about injustice. Last week we heard that you couldn't run fast enough. You couldn't be the greatest warrior. You couldn't be the greatest archer. None of that mattered. You were not going to be able to escape this punishment of injustice. He calls it immoral. Amos calls injustice immoral, treating people in ways that are unfair and unequal and out of balance. Morality lets us define an action as right or wrong, sinful or God-honoring. That's what our moral compass is. Is this right or wrong? The Bible has absolute standards to guide our moral behavior that are universally applicable. No matter who reads it, it is applicable to them. Excuse me. This absolute standard began at creation. God created Adam and Eve with a moral compass, and it was all perfect until they decided to eat the fruit of the tree of good, knowledge of good and evil. Now they knew what was good and what was wrong, what was godly and what was sinful. They knew it now. And now God had to send them out of the garden. That morality was no longer a way of life. And we see that with their children, Cain and Abel, who fought over, Cain did not like the fact that Abel's sacrifice was accepted by God more than his, so he killed his brother. The beginning of seeing how injustice just kept rolling. And today, we need to be aware of injustice. And we may not think that we're even personally involved. We may think we are the most just person that there is. That I am not racist, I don't care what religion you are, I don't care if you're rich or poor. And that may be true of everyone in this room. In many ways, that is true. But it does not mean that it's still not happening. As Amos wrote in his judgment to all people, not all of the Israelites were selling people. Not all of the Israelites were beating people. Not all of the Israelites were having sex immorally. Not all of them were doing these things that were listed as transgressions, but they were all being punished for those sins. No one could escape. It was a society that was guilty. We may not be doing the sinful thing, but as our society, we are all still guilty. There are many areas of injustice in today's world, but for this message, I'm just focusing on and making us aware of what has caused so much division in our country, systemic racism. And that was really the beginning impetus of this sermon series. It was going to be a whole series, and then when I started reading Amos more and more, I thought, oh, there's a lot more here. We need to look at a lot of it. And so today we're just really touching on what systemic racism looks like and what that means for us as Christians. Like many of you, I've been reading lots of books on racial reconciliation, on what it means to be a white person in these days and to be aware. There's a little stack of them here. Some of you still have some of my books, and so that stack would be about double. And so there's lots of stuff out there, and I've got things I'm listening to on Audible books, just to be aware. Becoming educated in history and the pain and even anger that has been displaying itself in the rioting and violence has been pent up for literally hundreds of years, being passed down. And even learning that that's kind of in your DNA, that anger and that frustration and that pent up pain is actually psychologically in you. And I didn't start studying that except I wanted to learn more about grief and realizing that grief can be part of now your DNA. And so we see that it's not something that can just be shunned or can't be just put aside easily, but has to be worked through. People who called themselves Christians found nothing wrong with buying and selling other human beings. They even used the Bible to make slavery right. Just because slavery was an acceptable way of life in the culture in both the Old and New Testaments doesn't make it right. We read about it, and Jesus talks about it, Paul talks about it. But recognition of slavery is a reality, not a commendation. We realize it's there. Jesus would not have wanted people bought and sold and treated as property. As Amos writes, that the people of Israel thought that as long as they continued the religious rituals, they could live an immoral life and God would still approve. They even believed that their prosperity and their peace was a sign that God was approving their behavior. And that was far from true. The people in the 1600s who were buying slaves to do the work of building the country reconciled that they were doing the right thing because they were seeing financial success and the growth of a nation. Even when they were writing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they put in the words, all men are created equal. But it was another 100 years before war broke out over slavery. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery, he's a black man, escaped slavery in Maryland, I think, and he became a social reformer and an abolitionist. And what a story he has. And he said, I would unite with anyone to do right and with nobody to do wrong. He was all for justice, all for white, black, female, Native American, Asian, whatever it would be. He wanted to see justice for all of these people. He was also a Christian, and he had this to say about white churches in the Civil War era. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I read that many times before I decided to incorporate it into the message this morning. But I thought this was in 1870 that he was writing this. What is the Christianity that we see in our land? Is it the Christianity of the Bible, or is it the Christianity that we have made to fit how we want to live our life? Since Africans were brought to America as slaves, they have been oppressed. And it wasn't until 1863 that President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that on paper freed the slaves as an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. 1863. But it would take another 2 years for the states to approve this 13th Amendment, that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. That was 246 years of slavery. 3 million people were freed at that time with no education, no land, no place to farm, nothing. They were just here freed out. Where do they get started? And sure, there were some people that broke through, some people that maybe had been educated on the sly, some people that became lawyers and doctors and leaders, and it happened, but it wasn't the norm. It wasn't what most people were able to fight through in those years. I love watching shows about ancestry, and they're showing some repeats of Who Do You Think You Are, or something it's called. And Smokey Robinson, the famous black singer, his family was being investigated. And I always find it really interesting when they do the black families, because it many times will bring you back to times of slavery. And sure enough, his great-great-grandfather was a slave and had been freed, and they were able to trace that, and he was so thrilled. But that relative, 20 years later, was still working for the same white farm owner because he knew nothing else. But now he was listed in the census as a farmhand rather than a slave. And hopefully he was being paid and cared for and had his own life. But there was nothing, they didn't know what to do. Systemic racism isn't about a single person, but as a society, as a whole. Even though black men were given the right to vote in 1870, many rules and laws made it almost impossible for them to actually go ahead and vote. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, they made a tax on it, they couldn't afford to pay for it. They made it impossible. Black women were not given the same right until 1965. 55 years ago was the first time black women could vote in the United States of America. Do we see that there is systemic racism, that there is hurt, that there is pain that comes with this? How is this justice for all? I just watched another program on PBS about the injustice of racial covenants that were used in the Minneapolis and probably St. Paul, but this was about Minneapolis in 1910. And that they became commonplace in the 1930s. When we bought our house in Linwood Township in 1982, there's a covenant in our deed, and a covenant is kind of like a restriction in our deed that we cannot raise chickens. We have 3 acres of woods, and I cannot raise chickens. I don't know if I can now, but it's in my deed, and I just had my refinancing done. I should look and see if it's still there. That was the covenant that I signed to, that we wouldn't have chickens or goats. But in 1910, the covenant said a black person cannot buy a house in this neighborhood. And it was lots of neighborhoods. And if you see those maps, you still see how it goes. And then there was redlining that came in that said that people were not able to, if you were black, you were not able to get a mortgage. So not only could you not live in these neighborhoods, but you were forced to live in this neighborhood, mostly all in rental property and mostly in like apartments. So why does that matter? So what? Well, so what is the fact that the people living in this neighborhood, my family, my mom and dad were not wealthy people at all, but they were able to buy a house, they were able to get a mortgage, they were able to have this home and have it for 50 years. And when both parents died and we sold that house, us children all got a piece of that inheritance. But if you are never able to buy a house, you don't have that inheritance to pass on to the next generation. So you get stuck in a system of poverty. That's systemic racism. That's injustice. There's entire books written, many books, many podcasts, many shows, many things that are on this subject. And I just don't have time for us to go into more details. But I hope that this helps you be aware of injustice that's happened. And not only in the black community, but in Hispanic community, in the Asian community, in Native American community, that there is injustice and immoral treatment that happens, and that we're all part of it problem. Just like the Israelites, we're all part of the problem if we don't do something to help the problem. Several of the scriptures also talk about immigrants and foreigners. And that's maybe a place that we can reach out. And it's another place that Christians are reaching out. And we're partnering with Jonathan House, which is a house in East St. Paul? Something? Okay, so there's two now, Jonathan House. And remember when we had a guest come from there and she spoke to us about these? It's asylum seekers. So these are people that are escaping, not just for a better life, but because where they are, they're in danger of being killed. So they come here, and there's all kinds of rules that they can't work for so long, and they can't. We are partnering with them, and you have voted for us to partner with them at our annual meeting, and we agreed to send $1,000. And the timing was wonderful. It was really what God had planned for us, because we found out that they are having a fundraising time right now, and in November is Give to the Max. And it's for all charities. All charities are part of this, and you can go into this and look for it. But they asked, could they use our $1,000 to be matched? And so on their website, it said, if you give money, it will be matched dollar for dollar by Rice Creek Covenant Church up to $1,000. And our $1,000 hasn't even been sent yet. It'll be sent tomorrow. And we already got an email saying that it had been matched. So our $1,000 equals $2,000 for them. And it costs, that will help 4 people for 2 months to be able to live in this home. And so we are doing our thing. And we're going to find out if there's other tangible ways that we can reach out to help with justice issues. Justice issues that Kyle's Boy Scout group is going to be helping with its Sanctuary Covenant. What are these calls that we can help answer? The lesson from Amos: God is a God of justice for all people. God is a justice for all people, and punishment and judgment are coming for those who do not treat people morally. And the reason I had Aiden read that long passage from Matthew is that Jesus said, you saw me hungry, you saw me thirsty, you saw me in prison, and you helped me. And they said, you weren't ever that. And he said, yes, but when you did it to the least of these. So how is it as a people, as a congregation, as individual people, can we do for the least of these? And it's not about doing. It's about being people of morality and people of justice. So I encourage us to keep learning. Years ago, and I bring this up all the time, that I went on the Sankofa journey about the civil rights movement. And the person I went with has written a few of the books that we have been reading. And she said to me, I said, what am I going to do? I have a basically all-white congregation living in a city that's basically all white. And she said, be educated, understand, learn, and talk about it. And I haven't done really good about talking about it, and I'm not going to talk about it all the time every Sunday, but I will keep us aware. And I just want us now to walk away today and not just be the same people that walked in here, but to be aware that maybe we are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. One of the most famous verses, and probably the only well-known verse that comes out of Amos, is our header verse today on your bulletin. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And you think, well, that's just a song that we sang at Bible camp all the time, and we really got into it. It was really rocking in. It was really fun. But the point is, water can't be stopped very well. Because even if you put up a dam to stop the water, that dam will break and the water will flow and rush. And so what Amos is saying through God is that we want to see justice flowing like that water that cannot be stopped. That it will be righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So that is our prayer. That we will be part of the solution rather than the problem. Let's pray. Our dear Lord God, oh, you are a God of justice. And we think, oh, it was your mercy that allowed for us to be forgiven. And is that justice on our behalf? And that you called your people, don't live this way. Follow me. Come back to me and live. Lord, forgive us if we have been blinded or we've turned our back to the needs of those who are experiencing injustice. Help us to become your hands and feet and mouth, and even just understanding and learning what it's like to live as a black or a brown person in this country. Help us to be loving to our neighbor, that you have called us to love God with all our heart, to love our neighbor, whoever that might be. So we ask, Father, that you will help us, that you will give us the strength, you will give us the wisdom, that you'll give us the encouragement, that you'll give us the boldness to understand and to discourage and fight injustice wherever we can. We thank you, Lord, for these lessons. We thank you for the nonprofit Amos, who was given this task to encourage us and to teach us. Help us to follow that. In your name, amen.
Will you join us in singing